Welcome to another video of biology. In this video, we're going to be tackling the idea of the electron transport chain. This follows us discussing the Krebs cycle. So in the Krebs cycle, we had the production of NAD and FADH. And these particular molecules are carrying the high energy electrons that are needed to produce more ATP, which after all, as we discussed in other videos, that's the main goal of this process. So following the Krebs cycle, which is the backside of this whole process, we are now going to be focusing on the electron transport chain, the final process, ATP producing process. Before I discuss the electron transport chain, I'm going to first discuss where this is happening. So you have the mitochondria. Here I have an enlarged picture of it. And in the mitochondria, you have the dark red, the outer membrane, okay? And then you have a pink intermembrane space, okay? And intermembrane meaning it's in between two membranes. So you have the outer membrane, and then you have the inner membrane, which is the borderline here of the yellow space, which is called the matrix. Okay, and this is the inner membrane space, also said intermembrane. So you have the pink space that's in between the outer membrane and the inner membrane. Okay, and then on the inside, the yellow, we call that the matrix. Okay, so again, our outer membrane, our inner, and then our matrix. Okay, and then right there, right in between the pink and the yellow, we have a phospholipid bilayer that we call the inner membrane, and that is where the electron transport chain is located and where the production of all of our ATP is going to occur. So let's take a closer look. At that inner membrane. Now, I have here some of the proteins that are most involved in this process. Okay, there are four main proteins. I have our NADH reductase. Okay, we have our succinate dehydrogenase, cytochrome reductase, and cytochrome oxidase. Okay, and then you have this little guy right here, ubiquinone. Okay, and this guy is responsible for transferring electrons, high energy electrons, back and forth from NADH reductase and succinate dehydrogenase. Okay, so again, it relays high energy electrons back and forth. Now, looking at NADH reductase and cytochrome reductase a little bit closer, you're going to notice that in this process, NADH will drop off its electron at the first protein here, NADH reductase, and then FADH, okay, so if you're looking at some of the differences between these two molecules, these energy carriers, besides the fact that FAD has two hydrogens and NADH has one, FADH will drop off its electron, okay, at cytochrome reductase. Okay, so these three molecules. And then you have the third one, cytochrome oxidase, which is where oxygen, okay, oxygen will be waiting for that electron as it finishes up in that process. So hydrogen is considered the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Okay, so hydrogen plays a very important role in the production of ATP as the final electron acceptor. Okay, now to kind of simplify this, we're going to, instead of using the technical terms, we can just use complex 1 for NADH reductase, and then we'll use complex 3 and then complex 4 instead of using the technical terms for these molecules. Okay, so complex 1, complex 3, and complex 4. Since these are the main players in this process, we're just going to use these in our illustration. So you're going to see in the next image that I'm going to get rid of our ubiquinone and our succinate dehydrogenase. Okay, and then of course I've added our one of the most important membrane proteins, ATP synthase. And you should already know what ATP synthase does based off of photosynthesis. Okay, but we'll still discuss it in any case. Alright, so let's take a closer look at NADH and FADH2. I mentioned before that they're electron carriers, high energy electron carriers, and these guys are coming from our Krebs cycle. Okay, well, Krebs cycle and glycolysis actually, okay, the two areas where these high energy electron carriers are coming from. Okay. Now, one idea that I want to come back and revisit is that the final goal to this is to make ATP molecules which actually do the work in the human body, like the relaxation and contraction of muscles. Actually, technically, it's the relaxation of a contracted muscle. But without ATP, the body basically doesn't work. Okay, so you're constantly going through ATP molecules throughout the entire day, and I've mentioned this before, that on any given day when you're just doing your average Joe stuff, your body is going through about 90 pounds of ATP. So ATP and ADP are constantly being recycled. But ATP is getting its energy from NADH and FADH2. So again, this is another example of thermodynamics, of the transfer of energy from one molecule to then another molecule, okay, and then finally to do some work. So let's go ahead and dive into this process, okay. So keep in mind again that we have here on the top, the pink, we have the inner membrane space, right, and then you have the matrix, okay. So do keep in mind the location of this process in the mitochondria. So you have your NADH and FADH coming from the Kreb cycle. NADH will come into complex 1, drop off its hydrogen ion, so now it becomes NADH+. Okay, it's got a positive charge. It drops off that high energy electron. FADH2 will do the same, drop off its hydrogen and release its high energy electron. Okay, so now you have your two free hydrogens and the high energy electron. And just like with photosynthesis, these electrons will make their way through the electron transport chain. And as they do, they're releasing their energy to push hydrogen ions into the inner membrane space, right? Now take a look at what happens to that electron. The final electron you see there, it's turned blue, signifying that it's already used up its energy in pushing hydrogen ions across the membrane space. Now, this electron, like I mentioned before, goes into complex number 4, okay? It goes in complex 4, and it meets up with oxygen, which is the final electron acceptor, okay? And it goes through a process, okay, thanks to complex 4, and it produces an H2O molecule, okay? And then here comes the next electron again. It's using its energy to push hydrogen ions across the membrane. Okay, and it goes to meet our final electron acceptor, oxygen, to then make a water molecule, okay, H2O. Okay, so again, if you remember our equation for cellular respiration, one of the waste products is actually water, okay, along with carbon dioxide, which was produced back in the Kreb cycle and glycolysis, or Kreb cycle actually. So now we're going to pay attention to ATP synthase. And again, this is where our ATP, most of the ATP is produced in the body. Now we did produce some ATP in glycolysis. We do produce some ATP in Kreb cycle, but this is where the bulk of it is produced, okay? The ATP synthase, just on a side note, on average, about every second can make about 600 ATP a second. Okay, so that gives you an idea as to how fast this process actually works. This molecule right here actually has 3 active sites where it can make 3 ATP at the same time. But I'm just going to be showing you I'm only going to be showing you 1 ATP at a time. But just keep in mind this is actually a very, very fast process. Okay, so you have a high concentration gradient, a high electrical gradient from the hydrogen ions. Okay, so there's a pressure gradient or a concentration gradient that's been created where you have a high pressure and a low pressure environment. And if you know anything, if you remember anything that we've discussed as far as how nature typically works, it doesn't like to have these imbalances. So it's going to go from there's going to be a push of high pressure to the low pressure. Okay, and that's where the ATP synthase comes into play, where these hydrogen ions, okay, this concentration gradient gets pushed through the ATP synthase, and as these ions, these hydrogen ions get pushed through it, it kind of turns. It turns the mechanism, the protein ATP synthase, the enzyme, and it combines ADP with another phosphate to make ATP. And now the work has been transferred over from the high concentration gradient. Okay, you had a lot of potential energy in that concentration gradient, which has been transferred over to our ADP molecule, and it combines an ADP with a phosphate again to make adenosine triphosphate. Okay, and this process on average can make up to anywhere from 34 to 38 ATP. It varies from person to person. Each person makes a different amount of ATP depending on the genetics, depending on their level of fitness, how efficient their body is at making energy and using energy. But this process is the main, is one of the ways that your body actually produces its body heat as well. It keeps the body's temperature at a certain level. So when you're cold and you feel your little hairs kind of rise up, that's because of the muscles that are contracting. Okay, and you also shiver. Your muscles are contracting when you shiver. When your muscles contract, okay, they use up ATP to relax again. So, and that every time ATP is being used up, and anytime the electron transport chain is being used, you are producing friction. You're producing heat, and that's how your body regulates its temperature. So in any case, this is the final process for cellular respiration. Again, the ultimate goal was to make ATP, and we've done that. And now your body can go about its day doing its normal thing. And yeah, so good luck on your studying. Okay, I want to take one more minute to just show the process at work without me commentating on it. So this is kind of like a little extra clip, if you will, just of the process at work, and then you can kind of view this, rewind as you please, so you can just see the process at work without me commentating on it. Okay, so here goes.